Hi, Karen Alari here. Thanks for joining me for this part 2 video of a two-part series where we'll be painting this little colorful scrub jay. The first video that in the series was taken from a live session, but in this second video I'm going to go ahead and finish the painting up as a more detailed tutorial. I've switched over to using Golden Open Acrylic paints as opposed to the heavy body paints that I used in the first video. I do this sometimes when I'm painting just because the open acrylic paints give you more open time, you can do more blending, and it's a little easier to blend your colors and have some smooth brush strokes, but it's not required. You definitely could just continue this painting with the same palette that you used in part 1 with the regular heavy body acrylics, and in fact the colors I'm using are pretty much the same in both videos. I'm just using the open acrylics here uh, for this section of the painting. You'll notice when I do use the open acrylics, when you see my palette there, you'll see that I don't have to use the wet paper towel and the palette paper. The paints are just sitting directly on the palette. And you can also, when you lay down the paint colors, you can lay them out in a long worm instead of in a pile, because again, they're not going to dry out as quickly. So I started out with using some quinacridone gold and white to start adding. I added some light side to some of those branches, and now I'm adding some dark, more shadowed side to those branches. Basically, I'm just looking to add a variety of color and value to the branches, and that'll make them look more natural. If you just use one light color and one dark color, or three colors, and they look all the same, they're not going to look as natural, because depending on the direction that the limb is facing and the things that are around it that may be reflecting color back onto the branches and the limbs, you're just going to get all kinds of colors and values in those areas. So I'm just laying those in with a small brush here. I believe it's a round brush, yeah. So a small round brush, it's fairly firm. You don't want to use very soft brushes with acrylics, because they just won't move the paint around sufficiently. You could really use either a very small flat brush or a round brush at this point in the painting. I just want to be able to get a small enough stroke onto those branches so I get a little bit of a feeling of detail, and I can stay within the confines of the branch itself. But working with brushes, use what works for you. Nothing is critical. So here I'm adding a little more of the green to this. You can use any dark green. In this palette I'm using the Jenkins green, whereas the other palette I used Hooker's green, but they're both just a dark green, and you can always intermix those colors and find ones that work for you. I'm just spending some time here reestablishing some dark areas on the branches, really just moving all around the canvas at once. There's a lot that's already been done on this painting, and you could really almost stop here, but I just want to add a little bit more detail in some areas, especially around the bird. I'll be spending a good amount of time working on his face and getting an expression that I want to get. But again, that's up to you. You don't certainly have to go into as much detail. Adding a little bit of white and a little bit of blue. That's the ultramarine blue that I'm using there. So what I'm doing is basically coming up with some reflected light on the other side of the branches. So you have the light coming in from the left, you have a shadow area, and then from the right you'd be getting some reflection from the sky, from the bird, from other things going on. And it's really those little touches of reflected light that add excitement to your painting. And if you haven't heard the term reflected light before, that's just color and light that gets reflected into the shadows generally from things around the element. So for example, I have reflected light on his belly that is going to be from a tree branch once I lighten that up a little bit and have it make more sense. But reflected light really adds some excitement to your painting, and it's fun to play around with. Working on lightening up that top area of the branches with, again, some quinacridone and gold and white, moving all around the canvas. It's so important when you're mixing colors to be sure that you use any particular color in more than one spot. So you'll want to move around the canvas and find other areas to add that color to as well. So it's just not all in one area. There's some of my Naphthol red light and some orange. In this palette, this is Pyrrole Orange. If you're using your regular heavy body paints, it would be the vat orange that I was using on that. But again, any orange that you find that you like to use works just fine. You're just, you're mixing the colors and looking at the color. So if the tube color you got is a little redder or a little more yellow, you can just add other paints to adjust it to where you want. And what I really love about uh, painting in acrylics is that you just lay down those colors and you can adjust them. Again, we're working with the open acrylics now, so you can see, I don't know if you can compare to the previous video, but you get a lot more open time, more blending time, and that's really the purpose for using the open acrylics. So I can lay down that paint color and come back quite a bit later, hours later even, and it'll still be wet enough to blend in another color. When I'm placing these red leaves, I'm being really careful not to vary their size, their shapes, their distance from each other. So keep that in mind, and you don't want to overdo. I'm adding a little alizarin crimson to that, and then I came in and I'm adding some shadow areas, breaking up those big red shapes with a little bit of shadow. So I'm not really thinking about painting the shape of a leaf, but I'm just introducing some shadow areas to that color as well. Now adding some more orange and some more red, getting back to that red color, and then adding yellow to that. So basically I added some shadow color, now I'm looking for more of a light color to add here and there. And noticing that I needed to add more white because it wasn't light enough in value. Always remember that the acrylics are going to dry a little bit darker, especially in your lighter values. So it's good to compensate for that by, when you lay down the paint, if it looks just right, you probably need to go a little bit lighter. Again, especially when you move into the lighter colors that have more titanium white in them. Just a touch here and there to add some areas of light onto those leaves. And once you get that dark, that medium, and that light, just touches of paint. That's the beauty of it. You don't have to stress over getting anything exactly right in this sort of impressionistic style, but instead you can just blur your eyes or step back often so that you can just see how that overall effect is, and just play with it, have fun. You notice when I lay down those strokes, I'm really pushing the brush into the canvas, changing the direction of it, moving it around, twisting it around. That helps me get different shapes, different brush marks. I wanted some areas that were larger there, a little more simplified. You don't want everything to be sort of polka dotty or confetti-like and all the same size and shape. So I'm adding some larger shapes there. Going back to a little bit more of my Naphthol red light. There are quite a few other paint colors on that palette that I'm not using in this painting. They just happen to be there from previous sessions, so don't worry about those extra colors because I'm not using them in this painting. Again, just breaking up those large shapes, squinting my eyes, and getting just an overall look. I like that orange in there because the orange is really going to contrast with our blue and just really make that blue pop because they're complementary colors. All right, back to the palette and then a little bit of our green, and then adding some of our Hansa Yellow Medium. I've also got some Hansa Yellow Light on that palette, but I'm not using it in this painting. And some white, so I come back with a rather chromatic, a kind of a pretty light green color, just to add some more shapes into that area. So you can tell I'm just building on everything that was already there, the shapes and the various colors and values, but I'm just adding to it, adding more layers. And the more layers that you get on there, the more interest that you have, and the more it feels as if you can come up to the painting and look under and through and find all kinds of different layers to it. It adds a texture, like a tapestry texture to it that I really like. Remember that those green leaves areas are behind those tree trunks, so I'm working around the tree trunks, not going over them with that green. You know, I'm always playing music when I paint, I would highly recommend that. It helps loosen you up and get you to enjoy the moment and get into the mood. We've talked about that in some of my other videos, but it's so important to bring a light heart to your painting. I really believe that you know, if you paint with a light heart and a loving kind of feeling, that translates into your painting, and it becomes much more fun for the viewer and much more appealing to the viewer. So I always advocate taking a moment before you start painting just to clear your mind and turn on some music that you like and take a few deep breaths and stretch your arms out. Let all the worries of the day go. Send that critic that's in your mind out the door, because he's not allowed here, because the experience of painting is what's really fun. And if you enjoy the experience as you're doing it, that comes through in your painting too. And I think you can translate that enjoyment of life and beauty out to the people that are viewing your painting. Adding a few touches of this sort of neutralized mid-tone blue to just give some soft distance to some of those trees in the background. Now we've got our, we're using some phthalo blue this time and white, because I'm coming in and readjusting that background sky a little bit, making sure that I get the right color and the right value. So when you put it down again on the canvas, if you want it to be the same color as what you have, then it needs to be a little bit lighter as you put it down and as it's still wet. Reshaping those branches. Just little subtle touches, breaking up the reds, cleaning up so I have a nice blue tone that's coming through there, and that's going to complement with the bird and give us those different touches of blue here and there in the painting. Just use your eye and decide what it is that looks good to you, and that's what you need to put. It's completely subjective. So as many of those sky holes as you like, or as few as you like, it's totally up to you. Okay, coming back with a slightly darker version of that color. Whenever you're putting sky holes in a dark area, and by sky holes I mean the little areas in the foliage where the sky is peeking through. So whenever you're using sky holes, you want to be sure to make that color just a little bit darker than the sky itself. Because when you place those sky holes with dark paint surrounding them, if they're too light, they're really going to pop out. So the trick there is to always darken the color when you're using sky holes. Same thing if it was distant mountains that were peeking through, whatever element it is that's peeking through with dark all around it, you'll need to use a darker version of that color. So I want to keep this top kind of light and airy. I don't want there to be this sort of dark, foreboding area that's hovering above the bird. So that's why I'm adding a lot of those sky holes into there. Into the little bush as well. You notice I really broke up that bush above his head. We had that all dark before, and now I've got quite a bit of lighter colors and values in there. Going back to my green and some of the ultramarine blue and a little bit of white. It's going to give me a darker blue-green color. Again, I don't want that area to be too dark, so that's why I'm coming in with that lighter color and a more green color, and then adding it here and there around the canvas, again, to integrate the color so that you don't just add a single color in one single area. All right, some more green. That's actually a phthalo blue-green there, but you could have continued to use that, the Jenkins green or the Hooker's green. I just happened to dip into that pile because it was close by and I wasn't thinking about it. But any of those dark greens would work just fine. Again, covering up more of that very darkest dark there to give us some more green. And that green's a slightly yellower version of what we just had previously, just changing up the color. The more often you can get these slight variations of value and color, the more depth you're going to have to your painting. Still using that small flat brush. Again, you could also use a variety of different brushes. I tend to like the flat brushes because they give an edge that looks kind of foliage-like to me. There's some of my purple and my naphtha red light and some white. So I'm going back to restate some of those purple areas now. Add some more blended color. Again, using these open acrylics at this point, which is letting me blend these colors together a little bit more and soften their edges. But if you were working in, if you're still working in the regular heavy body acrylics, that works fine too. You just need to be aware of the fact that you need to blend your edges as you go. If you want an area where one color blends into another, you have to do it. Rinse off your brush, dry it on your paper towel, and blend those areas together before they dry. Adding some white to that for a lighter version. You notice as I go from dark to light, I'll start with a larger space that's dark and then move to a medium color, medium value, and put in a little bit less. And then when I move to these lightest areas, I put in even less, just little spots here and there. And that's just, again, my technique, and you could absolutely do it any way that feels good for you. I just like to show you my techniques so that you have a place to start from, and from there you can develop your own. Got some yellow, Hansa Yellow Medium and quinacridone gold. This gives me sort of a mid-tone, rich golden yellow. You notice I'm sort of broadening out those areas. I'm taking away some of the detail and making some areas that are broader in color, just to simplify it down a little bit and edit it down. More yellow to that, and what you can notice is these colors are very transparent because I don't have any titanium white in them, and the white tends to make it go opaque. So especially in the open acrylics, they have a tendency to be even more transparent than the heavy body acrylics. So you can see I just took some straight red, and I'm able to blend those colors together on the canvas because they're still wet. So I'm just creating a lot of variety in there. Just some titanium white. I just had paint on the brush. I didn't mix it in with anything else, but it will blend right on the canvas and mix into the colors that are there. You know, when you're using the heavy bodies, then you have to be more careful to mix your color the way that you want it, because you won't get as much blending on the canvas. All right, a little bit of Indian yellow this time, mixed into those yellows that we've already got going on, and some Hansa Yellow Medium. Again, not thinking about making a leaf shape, just making a combined leaf shape, so a shape of a number of leaves together. You want to keep enough paint on your brush so that when you lay that paint down onto the canvas, you really get a good, confident brush stroke. Some ultramarine blue, just to vary up the greens that I have there in the shadow, make them more interesting. All right, some Quin Gold added to that, and some white. That'll give me a slightly more yellow and slightly lighter version. You can tell how I'm really twisting my brush and moving it around and changing the angle. You know, I'm not using any reference material when I'm making this foliage. And you could certainly use reference material, but sometimes I find when I'm looking at a photo, I get really stuck on the photo, and I get doing it like the photo. And I've found the more I've been painting that it's really fun not to have in mind a particular reference, but instead I'm just thinking about color and shapes of color and areas of color. Adding some white to lighten that up a little bit and to restate the light on the top of the branch there. Again, whenever, especially with your light colors, you'll find oftentimes that you have to restate your lightest highlights a number of times because of that drying darker effect. So there I took some of my green, some of my alizarin crimson, and some of the phthalo blue, and that's going to give me a very dark black, just a dark, dark color. I want to get a hint of his feet on this branch, but I don't want to have any detail there. I don't want him to stand out at all. So I'm just messing with that, going back and forth a little bit. I've switched back over to that smaller brush to just a touch here and there, and then look at it until you look at it and you think, okay, that looks, I get the, I know that's a foot. I know that's a foot, but it's not a detailed foot with the nails and everything really specific in it. Instead, it's just an impression of a foot. because your mind will fill in the rest. And if you make that area too detailed, it's just going to pop out and it's going to bring your eye to an area that's really not important. So I came back with some of this green to add some interest down there. Again, you know, when I'm thinking about, well, what am I going to work on next? I'm usually just, I look at the painting, and if there's any area that kind of just draws my attention, then I'll work on that until it stops drawing my attention. So in this case, I know I want to have something that makes his reflected light on his little belly make sense. So I knew in there I needed some sort of yellow colors, as if that light is reflecting on some yellow foliage in that area. So now I'm going to move back into adding some more detail on the bird itself. And again, you wouldn't have to put this much detail, but it's just something that I felt I wanted to do in this painting. So I'm struggling here with the detail using the open acrylic paints. And what I ended up doing, you'll see in a moment here, is that I worked on that for a while and then I wiped it all out again and switched back over to my heavy body acrylic paints, the ones we used in part one. And that's just because it's really kind of hard to add detail with the open acrylics because they blend. And it's hard to get a really crisp edge or little tiny details. So I'm back here to my regular open acrylics palette, my heavy body acrylics palette, and I'm just using the lid because I have this palette all set up for another project I want to do and I didn't want to get it dirty. And I know all I'm going to be using is some blacks and some grays and some light colors. I'm not going to be using very much paint here. I'm just going to be using my round brush and doing some little tiny detail work, trying to just give enough into the expression of this little guy that it creates some interest and it creates an expression. You know, I'll just keep going until all of a sudden this little bird is speaking to me. He comes alive, and I just never get enough of that. I just love that experience of painting. And you know, I call this video series an acrylic painting experience because I really want to emphasize that experience aspect of painting. You know, too often we get caught up with the final outcome and, oh, it has to be perfect, and oh, is this good enough? Am I good enough? And what I really like to do is just let all of that go when I paint and just enjoy the actual process of painting, of pushing those paints around, of taking the paint and mixing the colors, of seeing some little creature come alive on the canvas. That's the fun of it, really, and focusing on that enjoyment, I think really comes through in the finished painting. So like I said, I'm just using different versions of grays, and of course my grays I'm making with my phthalo blue, lots of different ways that I make grays. Basically, take any complementary colors like green and red or purple and yellow, or you can take a red, a yellow, and a blue. Any of those are going to make a gray, and you can experiment with the different kinds of grays that you like. And then I'm adding different values. So I'm adding a little bit of white, and you notice I'm using these little feather-like brush strokes around the edges. You don't have to cover a bird or an image that an animal that you're doing, say it's fur or feathers. You really don't need to cover the whole area in those little tiny brush strokes, but when you get to the edges where one color meets another color, or the edges of the bird, that's where just adding 2 or 3 little tiny strokes to indicate feathers or fur, and the viewer's mind will fill in that all the rest of that is feathers or fur. You don't need to paint in each feather painstakingly. I'm spending a lot of time on his eye because, you know, the eye is really that's what brings the expression, the eye and the mouth. really bring the expression to the bird. And I want this to look realistic, so I don't want it to look like a cartoon bird, but I want to walk that fine line to where you actually get a feeling of expression from him, from the bird. Restating that little white line that he's got right above his head there. Okay, yeah, so we got that little white stripe above his eye, little tiny brush strokes. I've got my kitty here on my lap. I don't know if you can hear her purring, but she likes to help me when I work on these videos. She loves these little jays too in the backyard. She watches them all day long through the back window. She thinks she wants to eat them, but I don't let her in the backyard. The backyard is for the birdies. Added that little white dot there to make his eye come alive. There's some sort of goldish colors in his eye that I'm trying to get a little bit of in there. Whenever you add that little shine on the eye, it really makes the eye start to come alive, I think. It really starts looking at us. Again, I'm just enjoying going back and forth, keeping an eye on my reference photo there. Adding a little white to that yellow mixture so I can lighten that up. Whenever an eye is rounded like that, you're going to get on the top surface some reflection from the sky, so it's going to be lighter up there. I don't want the eye too big because that will look, again, cartoony, but I always push the size of the eye a little bit just because you want that expression, or I want to get that expression in the painting so you can really see his eye there. This is much like doing portraits of people. It's amazing how just a little tiny brush stroke, a little adjustment of a shape or a value can really make a big difference in the look. Going back with that lighter to restate that little white ridge above his eye. You'll notice I have a lot of different values of grays in there. And those different lights, mediums, and darks, they really help in giving it a three-dimensional look so it just doesn't look flat. Coming in with some lighter gray to create some of that texture that's right around his eye. Putting some in and then blending it back out. Even though these are regular acrylics, I'm working in such a small area and working real quickly, I'm going to be able to blend those edges out as I go. I'm trying to get, you can see the shape of him is a little different than the shape in the reference photo. I'm not too worried about that. You could, again, I don't like to trace things like this because I don't like to get stuck on that exact proportion or the exact image. I really like to work with the painting as it happens on the canvas and, adjust it as I need to or not. I mean, sometimes most of the time probably it's just a happy accident, the way things turn out a little bit differently, but that's okay. It doesn't have to be exact. Again, that makes it more fun to do when you're doing nature scenes and animals and landscapes. You have a lot more leeway than trying to do a portrait where likeness is really critical. Going back and forth with those dark grays and those light grays, and just so that I get a real texture along there. But being careful that it ends up in the right value. Again, this might not be your cup of tea to do this much detail on something like this. And you certainly wouldn't need to, but I enjoy it. So, and if you start getting frustrated, sometimes I start thinking, oh, this isn't working, this isn't working. But just push through that feeling. If you just push through and keep looking at your reference and keep comparing the shapes and the values, and keep going back and forth with your acrylics, which are so forgiving, you'll get there. Be patient with yourself. This is a little more of a blue-gray to bring some more of that blue color into that gray area around his eye. And it's also a little bit lighter, leaving though some of that dark showing through, so you get more depth. You know, I've got that beak is light against that dark area, so I'm adjusting and adjusting those values and the shapes in his beak. Coming back with the dark again. I'm not showing you the palette anymore at this point, just because the colors we're using are very similar. We're just using the darks and the lights. Right now I've got more ultramarine blue on my brush because I'm working into the dark areas of his feathers there. And by working around them, I'm also shaping his beak area so that I see that lighter beak standing out against the darker feathers. Using that same, even though that's a blue, I'm putting some of that into his beak area there too. I've restated that a few times, that line of his beak, because I want to get just the right sort of turn to his mouth, if you could call it that, so I get an expression going on there. Just looking at my reference and really seeing where the light is hitting, where the shadow areas are, where the dark areas are. It's got a little crook to the edge of the end of his beak that goes down a little bit over the lower part of his beak. Again with some pure white, which is actually blending a little bit with the colors below that aren't quite dry yet. In general, I don't use pure white because it just tends to look really chalky. So when I do use it, it's in very small areas. Making that eye just a touch smaller. The area around the bird is done in those open acrylics, so it's still quite wet. So I'm having to lean my left hand against the easel and then resting my right hand against it so that I don't rest my right hand right into the wet paint. You can also use a stick that you lean against your easel to do that, have that same effect. Softening up the edge of that area again to make that look like feathers. I'm just using that blue, ultramarine, and white to put those little feather shapes right along the edge, and that makes that whole area look like it's made of feathers. Restating now a little bit again the shape of his head and his neck there. I don't have as strong of an angle as is in the reference photo. He's sitting a little bit more upright. It's just ultramarine blue and white At some point you just have to look at the painting more than you're looking at the reference, and just let the painting speak to you and see what it needs by looking at that. Using those bright blues again along in some areas of his feathers, so you have that dark area that's right around his beak to reshape his beak or to have his beak stand out against it. But once I get down onto his back a little more, I'm adding some lighter values. You know, it's getting a little more reflection, and I can bring that color back out a little bit. Pretty happy with him. He's starting to really look back at us, isn't he? A little bit of light on top of his foot there. Again, just that color starts to dry and starts to darken, and I want it just light enough, again, that it gives an impression of a foot. Some dark, reshaping that a little. And then finally some lighter. All just versions of the gray there that we've been using. Looking at his beak and the expression, he had sort of a downturn to his beak, almost a little frown, which is really what the reference photo was like, but just wanted him to be a little more cheerful, so I just did that tiny little mark to bring that edge of his smile up a little bit. To me, it adds quite a bit. Again, probably nobody's going to notice stuff like that, but I just wanted to make my little Jay happier. There he is in his surroundings. It's looking bright and detailed, and it's really catching your eye. Coming back with some blue now that's a little more neutral. When I looked at those sky holes, I felt like the blue was too chromatic, in other words, vivid of a blue. So I just, I'm coming back in with a blue that's a little more neutralized here. I've switched back to my open acrylic palette at this point, and it's all basically those colors that we've been working on all along. Back to those purples that we used with the purple and some red and some white, coming around those little sky holes I made just to soften up those edges. And if you come back with the colors around it, it tends to push the sky holes back into the tree. Now I'm restating those lights. Like I mentioned before, oftentimes you have to come back a few times to restate those lights. And because this area is starting to dry just enough that I can lay some of the lighter yellows on there. Again, this is the open acrylics. You don't want to use regular acrylics over the top of open acrylics in big areas like this. On the bird itself, I wiped out the wet part of the open acrylics in order to go back to using my regular acrylics. But in this area, we're going to stick to the wet on wet open acrylics and just adjusting those colors a tad more. I've spent quite a bit of time at this point that I've edited out of this process, stepping way back and just looking and seeing what the painting needs. You can see I'm taking some of that straight blue, that's the titanium white, with phthalo blue and a little ultramarine blue for that really vivid blue that we used on the bird himself. And I'm just putting some random blues over in that right-hand corner. They won't really show up, but they're going to really activate the oranges over there, and they're going to create those integrated colors into your painting. They don't necessarily have to be anything, they're just color notes to balance the painting and to integrate the color. restated that tail. It had a little bit of the dark from the branch behind it, and I just cleaned that edge up a little bit. We're just about to the end here of our little painting, and I'm just adding a few notes here and there, things that are standing out at me, and I hope you've enjoyed this process, and I hope it inspires you to pick up your paints and try to move outside of your reference photo, maybe use some of it like I did here with my reference of my bird, but then create your own environment, create your own color notes, create your own place for your little bird or your creature to use within that. So thanks for joining me. Here's our finished painting, and I hope to see you again soon. Have a great day.